In a time when Israel was afraid, God raised a woman full of courage. She was not a queen, yet nations listened to her words. She did not carry a sword, yet armies moved at her command. Her wisdom came from God, and her faith shook the enemy. When men hesitated, she stood firm. When hope seemed lost, she spoke God's promise. Her name was Deborah. And through her, God saved Israel. Choosing comfort over obedience. What began as small compromises soon turned into complete disobedience. As a result, God allowed Israel to face the consequences of its choices. This time, he handed them over to Jabin, the powerful king of Canaan, who ruled from the city of Hazor. Jabin was not just a political ruler, he was a symbol of fear, dominance, and cruelty. The true terror of Jabin's reign came through his army commander, Sisera. Sisera was ruthless, experienced, and confident in his military strength. He commanded 900 iron chariots, advanced weapons of war that made his army nearly unstoppable. Against farmers, shepherds, and poorly armed Israelites, these chariots were machines of destruction. Whenever Sisera's army moved, villages trembled. Roads became unsafe, trade stopped, and people hid in fear. Israel was no longer a free nation, they were living under constant threat. For 20 long years, this oppression continued. Every day felt heavy. Parents watched their children grow up in fear. Families whispered instead of speaking freely. Men who once stood boldly now avoided confrontation. The enemy controlled the land, the economy, and the spirit of the people. Israel had strength in numbers, but their confidence was broken. They knew they could not defeat Sisera on their own. His iron chariots crushed every attempt at resistance, reminding them again and again how powerless they had become. Slowly, desperation replaced pride. The people remembered how God had saved them before, through Moses, through Joshua, through earlier judges. In their pain, they finally cried out to God. This was not a quiet prayer, it was a desperate cry for mercy. Israel admitted its failure and begged God to rescue them once again. Their hearts were heavy, but their hope was not completely gone. Deep down, they believed that God still heard them. God was not silent. While Israel saw only fear and defeat, God was already preparing a solution. He was not planning to send another mighty warrior or a king with a sword. Instead, he was preparing someone unexpected, someone whose strength would come from wisdom, courage, and unshakable faith. At a time when Israel felt weakest, God was about to raise a leader who would restore hope and change the course of history. This dark period of oppression was not the end of Israel's story. It was the moment just before deliverance. In the silence of suffering and the weight of fear, God was already at work, ready to act, ready to speak, and ready to save his people once again. While fear ruled the land and the enemy seemed unbeatable, God raised a leader unlike any Israel had known before. Her name was Deborah. She was not introduced with a crown or an army, but with wisdom, faith, and authority given directly by God. In a broken nation desperate for guidance, Deborah stood as a judge and a prophetess. People from every tribe came to her, not because of her position, but because they trusted that God spoke through her. Deborah held court beneath a palm tree, later known as the Palm of Deborah, in the hill country of Ephraim. There, ordinary people brought their disputes, fears, and questions. She listened carefully, judged fairly, and spoke with clarity. In a time when confusion filled the land, her words brought direction. She did not lead through force, she led through truth. Her leadership restored a sense of order to a nation that had lost its way. What made Deborah extraordinary was her deep connection with God. She did not speak her own opinions, she delivered God's messages. As a prophetess, she heard God's voice and boldly shared his will, even when it challenged others. This courage set her apart. Leadership during that time was dominated by men, especially in matters of war and governance, yet God chose Deborah to guide his people. Her life proved that God's calling is not limited by gender, tradition, or expectation. As Israel struggled under Canaanite oppression, Deborah carried the burden of her people in her heart. She saw their fear, their exhaustion, and their broken confidence. But she also saw what others could not, God's plan for victory. While the people focused on Sisera's iron chariots, Deborah focused on God's power. She knew that the same God who had once parted the Red Sea was still able to defeat any enemy. Deborah's presence alone began to shift the atmosphere in Israel. Hope slowly returned. People no longer felt completely abandoned. They believed again that God was watching over them. Deborah reminded the nation of who they were, a people chosen by God, not meant to live in fear. Her words reignited faith, and her leadership united the tribes at a time when division was common. She was calm yet firm, gentle yet unshakable. Deborah did not rush into battle or make reckless decisions. She waited for God's timing and instructions. When the moment came, she was ready to act without hesitation. Her obedience was complete, and her confidence came from knowing that God was in control. Deborah's role as judge was more than a position of authority, it was a turning point for Israel. Through her, God was preparing the nation for deliverance. While the enemy believed Israel was weak and defeated, God had already placed the right leader in the right place. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change Israel's future forever. At the moment appointed by God, Deborah sent for Barak, the son of Abinoam, a respected military leader from the tribe of Naphtali. When he arrived, Deborah did not speak casually or offer advice, she delivered a direct command from God. The message was clear and bold. Barak was to gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and march to Mount Tabor. God promised that Sisera, the feared commander of the Canaanite army, would be drawn into battle and handed over to Israel. Barak listened carefully, but fear filled his heart. He knew Sisera's reputation. He had seen the iron chariots destroy entire regions. The odds seemed impossible. Barak believed in Deborah's connection with God, yet his own confidence was weak. He looked at Deborah and said words that revealed both his faith and his fear. He would go only if Deborah went with him. Without her presence, he refused to move. Deborah agreed to go, but she did not hide the truth. She told Barak that because of his hesitation, the honor of victory would not be his. God would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. This was not spoken in anger, but as a statement of consequence. God would still fulfill his promise, but the glory would go where faith was strongest. Barak accepted this, choosing obedience over pride. As the call to arms spread, men from Naphtali and Zebulun gathered. They were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, shepherds, and laborers, men who had lived under fear for years. Yet something had changed. Deborah's presence and God's promise stirred courage within them. 10,000 men assembled, not because they trusted their weapons, but because they trusted God. From the Canaanite side, Sisera received word of Israel's movement. Confident in his iron chariots and superior forces, he marched his army toward the Kishon River. To him, this was not a threat, it was an opportunity to crush rebellion once and for all. He believed the battlefield favored him. Flat land, open space, and chariots designed for destruction gave him every advantage. Deborah, however, saw the battle differently. She knew this moment was not about military strategy but divine timing. She stood firm, unshaken by numbers or weapons. She reminded Barak that God had already gone ahead of them. The fear that once controlled Israel no longer ruled the moment. Faith was now leading the charge. As both armies moved toward confrontation, the tension was undeniable. Everything seemed to point toward Israel's defeat, yet God's plan was unfolding exactly as promised. The stage was set for a battle that would not be won by strength or skill, but by obedience and trust. What looked like a reckless move to human eyes was about to become a powerful demonstration of God's authority over nations, armies, and fear itself. As the two armies faced each other near the Kishon River, the moment of decision arrived. Deborah turned to Barak and spoke with absolute confidence, telling him that this was the day the Lord would deliver Sisera into his hands. There was no hesitation in her voice. She knew God had already gone ahead of them. At her command, Barak led the 10,000 men down Mount Tabor and into battle. Suddenly, the battlefield changed in a way no one expected. Dark clouds gathered, and a powerful storm broke loose. Heavy rain poured down, soaking the land. The dry ground quickly turned into thick mud. the Kishon River overflowed its banks, flooding the plain. What had seemed like perfect terrain for iron chariots became a trap. Sisera's greatest weapon turned into his greatest weakness. The chariots sank, wheels jammed, and horses panicked. Chaos erupted in the Canaanite camp. The army that once moved with precision fell into confusion. Thunder, rain, and fear overwhelmed them. Israel's soldiers, once trembling at the sight of iron chariots, now charged forward with courage. God was fighting for them. Sisera's men could not stand against the force that had turned nature itself into a weapon. Realizing the battle was lost, Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. The mighty commander, once feared across the land, ran for his life. He escaped toward the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Jael belonged to a group that was at peace with King Jabin, so Sisera believed he would be safe there. Exhausted and desperate, he entered her tent and asked for water. Jael gave him milk and covered him with a blanket, making him feel secure. As Sisera lay down and fell into a deep sleep, Jael made a decision that would change history. Quietly, she took a tent peg and a hammer. With steady hands and fearless resolve, she drove the peg through Sisera's head, killing him instantly. The enemy commander was defeated not by an army, but by a woman fulfilling God's plan. Deborah's words had come true exactly as spoken. Meanwhile, the Israelite army continued pressing forward, completely defeating the Canaanite forces. Without their leader and without their chariots, Sisera's army collapsed. Victory was total. What had begun as an impossible fight ended in overwhelming triumph. God had turned fear into courage, weakness into strength, and defeat into victory. The battle near the Kishon River became a testimony that no weapon, no army, and no power can stand against God's will. Through obedience and faith, Israel was delivered. The enemy that once ruled them with terror was no more, and God's authority was made known to all. After the dust of battle settled, the reality of what God had done began to sink in. The power of King Jabin was broken, and his once feared army no longer ruled the land. Israel, which had lived in fear for 20 years, finally breathed freely again. The enemy that had controlled their roads, their cities, and their lives was defeated. Victory did not come from human strength alone, it came from complete dependence on God. Deborah and Barak stood as witnesses to God's faithfulness. Instead of celebrating themselves, they lifted their voices in praise. Together, they sang a song that would be remembered for generations. Their song honored God as the true deliverer and celebrated the courage of those who willingly stepped forward in faith. It spoke of leaders who rose, of people who answered the call, and of God who fought for his people when they trusted him. The song also honored Jael, the woman who struck the final blow against Sisera. Her courage proved that God can use unexpected people in extraordinary ways. She was not a soldier or a leader of armies, yet her obedience played a key role in Israel's deliverance. Through Jael, God showed that his plans are not limited by titles, strength, or social roles. Faith and courage matter more than position. As time passed, Israel continued to push back against King Jabin until his power was completely destroyed. The oppression that once crushed them no longer existed. The land entered a season of peace that lasted 40 years. Children grew up without fear. Roads became safe again. Worship was restored, and the people remembered who their true protector was. Deborah's leadership left a lasting impact on Israel. She was remembered not just as a judge, but as a mother to the nation, someone who guided, corrected, and encouraged God's people. Her story became a reminder that God raises leaders according to his purpose, not human expectations. When others doubted, Deborah trusted. When others hesitated, she stood firm. The story of Deborah teaches a powerful lesson about faith, obedience, and courage. It shows that God listens when his people cry out, and he responds in ways beyond imagination. He uses men and women, the strong and the unlikely, to fulfill his plans. Victory belongs to God, but he invites his people to take part through trust and action. Israel's deliverance under Deborah was more than a military victory, it was a spiritual awakening. It reminded the nation that whenever they return to God, he is ready to save them. The story stands as a timeless message. When God leads, no enemy is too strong, no fear is too great, and no situation is beyond hope. All